I have introduced Walid before. Walid doesn't need any introduction, so may I invite him to come and speak.
Thank you for that. I haven't done anything yet, so it's nice to... I'm going to try to take a slightly different tack to what Runda's done. Not because I think it's inherently a more valuable approach to take, but in fact, probably not. But just for the sake of introducing more elements into the conversation, and then hoping that throughout the course of Q&A and our discussion, we've kind of got more things to play with. I'm going to talk, I think, in more social terms. And I do this because I think that's largely what people want to know. I want to say up front, I think in some ways that's a bad thing. That the discussion about Muslims in Australia, or indeed anywhere, is almost never a theological discussion. It's almost always a political one. That is the prism through which Muslims are to be analysed, deconstructed, reconstructed, exonerated, or convicted, as the case may be. We are an entirely political species. And I say species because sometimes that's what it feels like. It's like we're in a zoo. These people, it's like these people go past and fascinated by this foreign species out of its natural habitat. And that's, I think it's sad that it's kind of ended up that way. The kinds of discussion, or the kind of discussion that proceeds from the things that Runda was saying is actually an immensely valuable one, but it's one that I suspect many people don't commit the time to and are not ultimately that interested in, which is a real shame, because the social and political discussion is almost impossible to divorce from it, and it's almost impossible to understand with any depth or any meaning in the absence of that discussion. So it's kind of with some trepidation that I embark upon this topic. What is the topic? The rise of Islam and the Australian experience. The rise of Islam. The Muslims are coming. This is wonderful. Yes. I'm not sure we are going anywhere, to be honest. The Australian experience. It's kind of, I mean, the reason you're all here, I guess, is because of this zeitgeist. It's because of this mood that means there's so much mystique, there are so many questions. And the questions, in some way, the very existence of those questions is enough evidence of the demeaning nature of the discourse, I think. Can Muslims fit into Australia? Come on, I mean, we've been here before, haven't we? Didn't we once ask whether Catholics could fit into Australia? They took I mean, it's funny, actually, the more I read about the Catholic history of Australia, the more I get this astonishing vivid sense of déjà vu. So, sort of, because it was Catholics, of course, particularly early 20th century and into the First World War, when a lot of Catholics were Irish, there was that whole discussion about whether or not Catholics took their orders from Rome and owed their allegiance to Rome, which, I've got to say, every Irish Catholic I've met doesn't give me the impression that they could care about Rome at all. But anyway... But there is that sort of, there's this idea of inability to have any sort of fidelity to one's society or any kind of stake in the well-being of one's own society. The idea that, therefore, they could not be good Australians. And then added to that was the political overlay, of course. Australia was in the service of the British Empire, particularly in World War I. That was the whole point. That's why we were there. And you had all these Irish Catholics who didn't like the British Empire very much. And so what did that say about their commitment to the country? And we had a conscription debate. And Irish Catholics opposed it because they didn't want to have to fight in wars for the British Empire. And there was a massive political split in the early 20th century of Australian politics. And, sorry, not the 20th century of Australian politics, but the Australian politics of the early 20th century. It was a massive split, and ultimately the conscriptionists lost that debate in a referendum. So we've kind of been here before. I've kind of got that feeling. And so there is a sense in which I kind of feel a little bit uncomfortable even entering into the discourse. But that, I suppose, is to blind oneself to reality and into some kind of naive fantasy world where the conversations that exist are only the ones that one would wish to design for oneself. And that's not only naive, it's probably a profoundly arrogant thing to do. So I'm going to try to move from that position. My talk starts now. The question of the future of Muslims in Australia and of, I guess, the emergence of Australian Islam is not actually principally an Australian sociological question. It's actually, I think, I mean, this is arguable, but I think it actually begins as an Islamic jurisprudential question. And the reason I say that is because at the heart of this is the core question about what it means to be a Muslim in any place. Is being a Muslim in Australia a different thing to being a Muslim in Egypt, for example? I don't know, I always use Egypt because that's my family background's Egyptian. There's no meaning to that, especially. But, or anywhere. I mean, being a Muslim in Bosnia, being a Muslim in Canada. Is there something different, inherently different about this experience? And that, I would argue, actually, is one of the key central questions that confronts Muslims all over the world, but especially in minority contexts. It's about what does their situation mean? The Australian context is, I think, a historically aberrant one. In fact, I think you are all, congratulations, you are all witnesses to history. The experience of Muslims in Australia has never appeared before in the history of the Muslim world. And Australia's, I guess, not unique in this. You could say the same thing for the US or the UK or Canada or any of the New World or even much of Europe, in that what you have is not a community of people who are Muslims who have taken on Islam and evolved a Muslim community organically. What you have, if we're being entirely honest, is a thoroughly inorganic community, which is precisely why Professor Abdullah Saeed rightly does not like the term Australian Muslim community. Well, there isn't one. There is one in our sort of political and social fiction, which therefore makes it more real, but there isn't really one. It's not an organic entity. Something like 70 different ethnic groups in that. Now, does that matter if they're all Muslims? Well, yes, it matters, and it matters for a few reasons. One, the fact that they are all Muslims doesn't tell you much about what they think about Islam. What determines their attitudes and their approach to Islam, both mentally and in practice, is usually has more to do with their experience. This was impressed upon me vividly in a conversation I had once with a Muslim who was a migrant from Albania. Albania at the time was under communist rule, and he came to Australia to flee communist rule. And he told me a story about how when he was in Albania during the month of Ramadan, which is the sacred month in the Islamic calendar where Muslims are fasting, during that month, the government would send out its agents with food and offer food to its citizens. That sounds like a nice thing to do, but it's not, because if they refused to take food, then at least in this man's story, they were taken off to prison. That is, the religious practice of that nation was crushed out of it from an authoritarian communist regime. When they came to Australia, they came with an entirely different relationship to their religion, and in many cases, it was they were weaned off it. Well, not weaned, it was beaten out of them. And so a lot of Albanian Muslims have a relationship to Islam that is entirely nominal, really. Some don't, of course. Quite a few don't, but some do. It's a product of the circumstances in which their practice of Islam was born, really. It's very different to the kinds of communities that we now see migrating, say, from Somalia. So you have these different historical relationships with Islam that are there. But on top of that, at a purely theoretical level, and this is where the Islamic jurisprudential element is important, there is the question about to what extent does culture have any sort of influence on Islamic practice and Islamic thought. On one reading, there's no reason why it should. The Quran is the same, no matter where you are in the world. The statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, there is disagreement about what's authentic and what isn't, but those disagreements are not usually cultural. they're more sort of that nerdy discussion about historical authenticity than they are some social discussion about what's culturally appropriate and what isn't. So why should there be? There's just one Islam, isn't there? And that's certainly become a popular view in the Muslim world, or in some parts of the Muslim world. And it's become a popular view among elements of Muslim communities in the Western world. And it's not a view that's entirely ridiculous. It's got something to be said for it, particularly when you observe around the world the extent to which atrocities are committed in the Muslim communities, in the Muslim world, purely on the basis of cultural customs. Female genital mutilation, an example that Runda gave, is one of them. Not on the basis of Islamic text, but really on the basis of custom. Isn't there something to be gained by cleaving Islamic practice from cultural practice then? Well, arguably. The problem is that in Islamic jurisprudential terms it just doesn't work that way. And it never really has, certainly not in the classical Islamic tradition. Because in the classical Islamic tradition, and this is a very lengthy discussion, but there is this concept, the idea of what the legal maxim in Arabic is al-urf muhakkam, that the customs, that cultural customs have a legally binding effect in classical Islamic jurisprudence. Now, let me be clear here. That doesn't mean that everything that is a cultural custom is therefore either accepted or not on the basis of the fact that it's a cultural custom. But what it means is that no Islamic jurist can, if they're doing their job correctly, proceed to develop a jurisprudence, proceed to develop some idea of how Muslims should be living without taking account and in some cases incorporating cultural elements into their accounting. Because cultures, in a sense, are systems of symbolic meaning. If you remove them from the equation, you end up with a highly artificial world and you have to impose a new set of symbolic meanings on it. It doesn't work. This is why, and it's an interesting experiment if you've got the money and the time, fly to Turkey and then fly to, say, Pakistan or India. The reason I picked those two countries, or those two regions, is because there really should be no difference between them, jurisprudentially, if you believe that culture should have no impact. Shouldn't be. Not only are they both Muslim majority nations, but the majority of people in both these regions subscribe to a particular school of thought within the Islamic jurisprudential tradition, that is the Hanafi school of thought. So to put this in really basic terms, in Sunni Islam there are four really big jurisprudential schools. One of them is the Hanafi school, and it's the most popular school in Turkey, and it's the most popular school in Pakistan and India. Yet the jurisprudence of those two countries and the practice of Islam in those two regions, the contrast is unbelievable. And there's several reasons for that, but one of the key reasons for that is the cultural imperative that pushes itself into Islamic jurisprudential thinking. And this is most clearly visible, I think, in the respective roles that women have in those two societies. In the subcontinent, much of the jurisprudence that emanates from that region takes on a patriarchal stance. That's true because that was true before Islam arrived there. It's less true, it's not entirely untrue, but it's less true in the Islamic discourse of Turkey. And you could perform similar comparisons across the Muslim world and come up with similar answers. What does this have to do with Australia? Well, a lot. Because in Australia what you have are, let's say, people from 70 different backgrounds, and with that comes 70 different understandings of Islam, just with reference to the cultural element, not even considering, on top of that, differences of textual interpretation and so on. Not even getting into that realm, which is a vast realm. So instead of having a community that has kind of evolved organically, an understanding of Islam that incorporates its pre-existing culture and so on into that understanding and that works for that environment. What you now have is a whole lot of people, and this is just first generation, wait till they have kids. It's like people like me, and it gets really complex. But you have people from all over the world with their varying experiences, their varying understandings of Islam that have been coloured by various cultural experiences, often not entirely aware of the extent to which that cultural experience has influenced their Islamic practice. Because where they came from, for example, Islam was just practiced as it was. There was no need really to try to deconstruct it in this way. And now you put them all together in a completely new environment as a minority, and you say to them, sort yourselves out. That's tough. And then they have kids who don't necessarily relate to the culture of the homeland, but relate in varying degrees to the culture that they've been born in and they live in. And now you say to them, now get along. And it's difficult. The upshot of all of this is that on just about every question, theologically, jurisprudentially, socially, politically, within the Australian Muslim communities, there's an intense debate about just about everything. And one of the key questions is going to be about what Islam in a sort of minority context like this is going to look like. Does it look like Islam looks elsewhere? Does it look different? To what extent should Muslims be incorporating the dominant norms of Australian culture, whatever they are? And that's another discussion. To what extent should we be incorporating those things into developing our view about what it is to lead an Islamic life in Australia? How do we do that? Now that requires quite astonishingly good scholarship, which I think it's fair to say is something that we're probably lacking in Australia. But I just want to finish on this. That question about the extent to which Muslims should be and are and will be, and exactly how they will develop a kind of indigenised Islam in the way that they have all over the Muslim world. That question is not just a question that Muslims influence. Because much of the response that Muslims have to that question is not sort of sober, dry, academic, Islamic jurisprudential response. Much of it is conditioned by social experience. To put it really, really bluntly, Muslims who feel that they live in a country that's hostile to them are probably less likely to embrace a view of Islamic jurisprudence that says that the incorporation of that culture that they feel is hostile to them is an important thing for them to be doing in their environment. They're probably less likely to do that. And so the question, what was the first question that was on that list? How does the Islamic community see itself in Australia? And the second question was, how does the Australian community see the Islamic community? Notwithstanding the problems with that question that Rhonda's identified, they're actually they're inextricably linked. Because, let's put it in sort of John Howard political terms, if the question is, do Muslims see themselves as Australians? That question can never be answered without also asking and then answering the question, do Australians see that it's ever possible for Muslims to be Australians? And that raises fundamental questions about what's Australia and what's Australianness. And my one thought that I'll leave you with is this, that if we're going to build the kind of society that allows for authentic diversity, and what I mean by that is a society where people feel that they can sustain multiple identities authentically without having to trade in some way or compromise on one, then we probably need to think about creating a society where belonging and membership of that society is not determined by some kind of cultural concept. That to be Australian is not a cultural question. It's a civil question. That is, to be Australian is about the citizenship that you have, the relationship that you have, the rights that you have, the responsibilities that you have to your nation and with respect to the government, but not about questions like personal values. Now, that's a challenging thought. My initial thought about it is that Europe is incapable of moving that way, of having a conception of the nation that is not ultimately a cultural, ethnic conception. America's much better at it. They're not perfect at it, they're much better at it. We're somewhere in the middle. And there's a reason, I think, it's not a coincidence, that Muslims in Europe are finding it much more difficult to integrate, if that's the goal, than Muslims in America. That there is greater hostility, there are greater intercommunal tensions in Europe than there are in the United States, notwithstanding white supremacist movements and all that stuff. It's something to think about. And so now I think it's going to give you some thinking music while we just talk amongst ourselves, and then in Q&A hopefully someone will have a question or throw a shoe or something. Thank you.
Thank you, Walid, and thank you, Randa, for this very insightful and interesting and highly relevant presentations. As Walid said, these are difficult issues to deal with, difficult problems. They're not simple questions or simple issues that can be sorted out in a matter of, I guess, few minutes. I think what comes out of both presentations is a sense of the difficult nature of the topic that we're dealing with, and also the sense that Muslims, wherever they happen to be, whether they are in Australia or in Saudi Arabia or in the United States, bring with them, if they're coming from somewhere else, a whole lot of ideas, values, norms, understandings, issues, ways of looking at the world. And those understandings, if you're looking at the Australian context, cannot be reduced to just few dot points or 1, 2, 3. This is what Islam is all about. Randa talked about the issue of women and the richness of Islamic jurisprudential literature and the high degree of freedom that existed in early Islamic tradition as far as women are concerned, and how a lot of those freedoms, gains, etc., were somehow curtailed in the development of Islam, say in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries onwards. And the way, the kinds of experiences Muslim women have in a number of Muslim contexts. Again, these things cannot be generalized. There are Muslim communities out there in the world where women have a fairly high degree of freedom, and the rest, there are many Muslim communities where they don't have that kind of freedom. It's not just a question of interpretation. Interpretation plays an important part. As Walid went on to link between the culture and interpretation, say in the case of women or being Muslim in Australia, there's a very high degree of very close relationship between culture and the cultural context in which a Muslim, whether the Muslim is an intellectual, scholar, an average Muslim, functions, and the interpretations that person adopts or puts forward. I think as Australian Muslims or Muslim Australians, whichever way you want to look at it, the issue of interpretation, the relationship of Islamic jurisprudence, classical jurisprudence, to the contemporary context in which we live in is important. Now, I would probably, I'm not going to make a commentary on what they said, but let me just ask you, each of you, the question about both of you actually raised the issue of jurisprudence and how that may or may not be related to the kinds of questions we are trying to do as far as being Muslim or being a woman or being this is concerned. How do you see the future of thinking in Australia as far as interpretation and Islamic jurisprudence and relating that to contemporary Muslim experience and situation is concerned? It's a fairly big, broad question. But reflect on that and say a couple of words. Randa, in relation to women, where do you see this, the Islamic thought, or in Australia is heading? I mean, Walid said, well, there's very little here. I mean, I agree with Walid. There's very little in Australia on that. There's very little creative scholarship that is coming from within the Australian Muslim communities at this stage. We rely very heavily on what's happening elsewhere. But just as a wish, what would you like to see in that area, Rand?
Well, there was a point when I was trying to make contacts with Muslim academics, Muslim scholars, about certain sort of jurisprudential issues that I wanted resolved and wanted to speak about with them. And I found it very difficult to find somebody who I could sit down and basically pick their mind on a certain issue. That was a couple of years ago. And then I got into contact with various women, mainly in Melbourne, and they really opened my eyes to the increasing number of Muslims who are undertaking scholarship within Australia about, Islamic law and jurisprudence. So I think that it's increasing, the interest is increasing, possibly because people are realising that we need to take ownership of our understanding of Islamic law rather than rely on our parents' generation who are feeding us Islam with their cultural baggage. And I think because we are mainly second-generation Muslims, we're trying to access the texts, access the classical texts on our own terms, and rather than through the proxy of our parents and their generation.
Thank you.